In the fall of 1998, my wife Lisa and I were living on a small farm outside Gap, Pennsylvania. We grew vegetables, kept a handful of chickens, and had a few acres that backed up to a larger cornfield belonging to my neighbor Chuck. We weren't full-time farmers. I worked part-time at a feed store in town, and Lisa helped run the church's food pantry, but we loved the simplicity of that life. Our daughter Ellie was 9 then, and she loved running around with our dog Mabel, a scrappy little border collie mix who thought she owned the whole property. One night in late September, we suddenly heard Mabel barking like crazy at the back door. I was already in bed, but the barking wasn't her usual bark. It was sharp and urgent. I rolled out of bed and looked out the window in our second-story bedroom. Mabel had already gone out of the doggy door we have and was standing near the back porch, barking toward the cornfield behind our house. Her body was stiff and her tail was straight like she was ready to fight something. I was thinking she had to have seen some kind of animal, but part of me was worried there might be a person out there too. That's when I noticed lights out in Chuck's field. There was this faint circular glow. It wasn't bright like a tractor or other farm equipment, but soft and dim, and it had this shimmer to it. The light seemed low too, not on the ground but near it, and it looked like it was turning slowly in one spot and in a way that didn't make any sense. I couldn't tell exactly what I was looking at. Lisa got out of bed, walked up behind me, and asked me what I was looking at. I pointed out the lights, and we both stood there and watched it. From our vantage point, it was hard to make out any detail, but the lights seemed to form a rough circle. They moved a little, almost like they were tracing a pattern in the field. I remember thinking it was strange, but not necessarily alarming. Chuck was known to tinker with equipment, so I figured maybe he was working late on some project or had a late-night problem that he was fixing. After what could only be a few minutes, the lights turned off, and Mabel finally stopped barking. Lisa said it had to be Chuck out there working on something and went back to bed, though I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something about it wasn't normal, so I went downstairs and called Mabel in for the night just in case. After that, I made sure the doors were locked, walked upstairs, and went back to bed. The next day was Saturday, and I went about my usual weekend chores. I was cleaning out some of our garden beds when I saw Chuck by the fence between our properties. He looked a little agitated, so I walked over to say hi and see what was up. Chuck told me someone had come onto his property during the night and messed with his cornfield. He said some of the stalks were broken, others were bent straight down to the ground, and a few were even burned near the base. He said it didn't look random and that it looked like a deliberate pattern, almost like someone had taken the time to arrange it. I told him about the lights we'd seen the night before from our bedroom window, and he nodded, saying he had already called the police and reported it. He was definitely a little pissed off and wanted to find out who did it. He was convinced it was kids out being idiots and vandalizing his property, but after talking to him, I felt like something was off about the whole thing. The day after that was Sunday, and in the middle of the afternoon, a black Chevy Tahoe pulled into our driveway and parked right in front of the house. I was out on the side of our house when they pulled in, and as I was walking around to see who it was, a man stepped out of the vehicle wearing a plain black suit. I waved my arm and said, "Can I help you?" He walked right up to me and introduced himself as being with an environmental agency. He didn't give a name, didn't show any identification, just launched into asking me questions. He wanted to know if I'd seen anything unusual the past few nights, specifically mentioning lights and crop damage in the area. I immediately told him about the lights in Chuck's field and the damage to the corn, but as I was telling the story, I started noticing things about him that were straight up weird. His skin didn't look normal, and he was an extremely pale guy. His face was smooth, without any lines or creases like you'd expect on someone his age. Even his hair looked like it had been placed on his head. Another red flag is that he didn't write anything down and barely responded to what I was saying. He just kept asking all of these specifics about what time I saw the thing in Chuck's field, how long it lasted, and what it looked like. When I asked him for more information about the agency he was with, he avoided the question and repeated that he was just following up on environmental concerns that had been reported in the area. The whole encounter lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt much longer. When he finally walked back to his SUV, I stood there watching as he climbed in. There was another man in the SUV, but he never turned his head or acknowledged me in any way. The two sat there in the driveway for a few seconds, then pulled out and headed down the road. I remember feeling a wave of relief when they were gone because it made me feel like I was in trouble for something. It was a very weird conversation, to say the least. Over the next few weeks, life went back to normal. Chuck and I talked about it a couple more times, and he also got a visit from the same guys asking for information. He even let the guy walk out into his field and check everything out. He got close to no information about these guys, just like I did, and neither one of us saw or heard from them ever again after that. The following year, Lisa and I ended up selling that property to move to Lancaster, and we've been here ever since. Every so often, I think back to that night and remember the lights in the field and the visit from those two guys and the way it all felt so weird. I know this doesn't really fit a typical sighting story because I don't have any idea what we saw, but the whole experience has always left me feeling like something wasn't right. Whatever was in Chuck's field wasn't right, and the guy asking questions really wasn't right. I loved living out there at the time, but looking back, that experience creeped me out, and I'm glad we moved into town. Back in October of 2003, my buddy Eric and I decided to go out to Joshua Tree for a climbing trip. We were in our late 20s, we'd been climbing together for years, and figured it was the perfect chance to get in a last little adventure before the colder weather rolled in. Eric had his old maroon VW van that we both loved, though it had broken down on us on more than one trip, and we loaded up our climbing gear, a couple of crash pads for bouldering, some basic camping supplies, and 2 six-packs. The plan was to camp at Hidden Valley Campground, climb as much as possible, and just soak in the desert. We got to the park late on Sunday afternoon, and the campground was pretty quiet. That's the nice part about going to Joshua Tree in the off-season. We were lucky enough to grab a spot that was tucked right up against some big boulders. After setting up camp, we made a quick dinner of Nally's chili and Kraft mac and cheese, our usual dirtbag climber fare, and sat outside under the stars with a couple of beers. The sky was incredible, crystal clear, and the Milky Way was stretched out overhead like a giant ribbon. It wasn't even that cold for a fall night. That's when I first noticed something. I was leaned back on my camp chair, just staring at the sky, when I saw what looked like a faint ripple in the air. It reminded me of the heat waves you see rising off the pavement in the summer, that kind of mirage thing that happens. It was subtle, almost easy to dismiss as my eyes, but it was there, hanging in the sky above some rocks near the edge of the campground. It was so subtle that I didn't even mention it to Eric. I figured I was just tired from the drive. The next morning, we headed over to Intersection Rock to climb a route called North Overhang. If you know anything about climbing, it's a beautiful, easy 2-pitch 5.9 that is a classic in the park and so much fun. Eric was leading the first pitch while I belayed. As I watched him make his way up, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker off to the left. I turned my head, but there was nothing there, just desert and scrubby plants. It was quick and barely noticeable, but enough to make me look around for a second. It almost felt like it could have been one of those annoying eye floaters you get sometimes. After that, I totally forgot about it. Later that afternoon, we drove over to Echo Rock to climb another route. On the way there, Eric suddenly slowed the van. He didn't say anything right away, but he kept glancing in his side view mirror and then out the window. I finally asked him what was up, and he said he thought he saw something weird. He said it looked like the light bending around something above the road behind the van, almost like there was something there, but he couldn't quite see it. That got my attention because I'd been seeing a few weird things too. I didn't really say anything other than I wished I'd seen it too and agreeing that it was weird. That night back at camp, we grilled some burgers on a little portable stove and stayed up late flipping through our guidebook and talking about the routes we wanted to climb the next day. The stars were just as amazing as the night before, but I noticed there was an undercurrent of tension, like we were both a little on edge but didn't want to say it out loud. Around 10 or so, Eric pointed out a spot in the sky above one of the bigger Joshua trees. I followed his gaze, and sure enough, I saw it. The best way I can describe it is, there was a distortion in the stars. It looked like a bubble slowly drifting across the sky. The stars behind it didn't disappear, but they were slightly warped around the edges, like looking through a glass of water. It wasn't moving fast, it just kind of floated there. We sat there for a little bit watching it until we lost sight of it. It's hard to explain, but whatever we were seeing would be hard to spot even if you knew where to look. But with it moving slowly, we just lost where it was at. The next day, the weirdness continued. We climbed a route called the Bong, a fun slab near Cap Rock, and after that headed to Hemingway Buttress to do another route called Pope's Crack. All day I kept catching glimpses of something, sometimes out of the corner of my eye and sometimes just straight on. Eric was seeing things too. It was never visible long enough to really stare at it or figure out what you were looking at, but something was definitely there with us. I could almost feel it around us by the end of the day. We packed up our gear for the night, both exhausted, and decided to make another easy dinner so we could get to bed. We had to head back home in the morning. During the 25-minute drive out of the park, we didn't really talk much. The van rattled along and we were both tired from climbing and lost in our own thoughts. We stopped at a Chevron in 29 Palms to fill up the van. Eric went inside to grab a few snacks and drinks for the drive home while I stayed at the pump. I joined him inside after a minute, and he was talking to the cashier, who was an older guy with a white beard and a flannel shirt that looked like it had seen better days. This kind of surprised me, but as I walked up to the counter, I heard Eric talking about the weird things we were seeing in the park. The ripples in the air and the mirage-like bending of the light around something, and he asked the guy if he'd ever heard or seen anything like that. The cashier didn't really react much, but he did say something that instantly burned into both of our memories. He said, and I quote, "It liked you guys because you noticed it." He didn't elaborate or explain what he meant by that, or even really look up at us. He just handed us our bag of snacks and drinks and said, "Have a safe trip home." The rest of the drive home was pretty normal, and we talked and even laughed about what that guy at the store said, trying to figure out what he meant by it, or if he was just messing with us. We've taken several other trips to Joshua Tree since then, and we always bring it up at some point when we're out there, usually in the middle of the night when neither of us can sleep. Occasionally, out of the blue, Eric will text me something simple like, "Do you think it's still out there?" It's just such a strange experience we both had, and I know it'll always be this thing we have together. In the summer of 2018, I was a junior at Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana. I had been dating a girl named Aurora for about 3 months. Aurora was studying environmental science, one of the more common majors at MSU, and she was the kind of person who seemed perfectly at home in Montana. She loved the outdoors, had a sharp sense of humor, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that I admired. That July, we spent a lot of time exploring the area together. We both loved hiking, running, going to local restaurants, and occasionally just driving around to explore. One night in late July, after having dinner at this Italian place downtown called Bella Luna, I suggested we go enjoy the warmer night and watch the stars up at a trailhead parking lot near Highlight Canyon. It's about a 30-minute drive out of town and has such a peaceful and beautiful view of the night sky. We left the restaurant about 9:30 p.m. The air was still warm and we had our windows open all the way up to the trailhead. By the time we reached the parking lot, it was nearly 10 o'clock. As expected, the place was deserted. The lot is at the base of a trailhead, bordered by a dense pine forest on 3 sides with a clear view of the sky above. I parked near the edge of the lot and we climbed into the bed of my truck, spreading out a couple of blankets to lay on. The stars that night were stunning. There wasn't a cloud in sight, and the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a massive river of light. Aurora pointed out constellations as we lay there. She knew more than I did about astronomy, although she didn't claim to be an expert. I remember her talking about Orion and the Summer Triangle in her usual calm and steady voice as she traced the shapes with her finger. I really remember how happy and content I was being there with her. We had been lying there for about 20 minutes when I noticed something strange. Directly above us, there was almost a perfect circle of stars that seemed to appear. It had to have just shown up because we'd been looking at the entire sky for a while. At first, I thought it was part of a constellation that my eyes had finally adjusted to see, but the longer I looked, the more unnatural it seemed. The stars in this circle were less bright than the others, and their arrangement seemed precise. I pointed it out to Aurora, though it had already caught her attention, and she immediately said that it was not natural. Within a minute, the circle of stars started to rotate like it was on an axis, slowly at first and rotating clockwise. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle, deliberate motion. We both kept watching, trying to convince ourselves this was something rational, but the movement continued, and we noticed it spinning even faster. These stars maintained their perfect circular shape as they spun, like they were part of a single object rather than individual points of light. After a few minutes, the circle was spinning fast enough that the individual lights blurred together into a continuous ring of light. We were trying to guess the altitude of the thing, and it looked to both of us like it had to be around the cruising altitude of a commercial jet. Maybe 30 to 35,000 feet up. It was hard to tell though. As the rotation increased in speed, we noticed the light got brighter. I wouldn't call it bright, but it was now about the same brightness as the rest of the stars. The ring spun faster until it reached a point where it looked like a perfectly smooth ring of light in the sky, just hovering there. As soon as it hit what seemed like a perfect ring, the whole thing began to fade. It was hardly noticeable at first, but it was like someone was turning down a dimmer switch. Within seconds, it faded down so dim that we couldn't see it anymore. We sat there waiting for something to happen, but it was gone. Neither one of us moved, and I'll never forget the silence around us up at that empty trailhead parking lot. It was making us both feel uncomfortable and vulnerable, and I personally felt like I wanted to jump back in the truck and take off. I tried to stay as calm as Aurora seemed to be though, and just sat there with her. After what felt like an eternity to me, I finally told Aurora that we should probably leave. She nodded without saying a word, and we climbed out of the truck bed and got into the cab. When I turned the key, the engine hesitated for a moment like it had a low battery. I've never been able to explain it because my truck was a fairly new Ford F-150. The drive back to the main road was tense. The only sound was the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires as we left the parking lot. Aurora was very quiet and only said a few things to me until we were back on the highway. It wasn't until we got back on pavement and were heading toward town that we started talking about what we'd just seen. Her analytical mind suggested that maybe it was some kind of failed rocket that had gone out of control, spiraling up or down, but from our vantage point had looked like a circle to us. I told her that could be possible, but I can't tell you how much I knew that wasn't it. This thing was making a perfect ring in the sky for well over a minute. I think she knew that wasn't right, but wanted some kind of answer. When we got to her apartment, she hesitated before getting out of the truck. She asked if we should tell someone about what we'd seen. I remember telling her that I didn't think anyone would believe us, and she didn't argue. She just nodded, gave me a longer than normal hug goodnight, and went inside. I sat in the truck for a few minutes trying to process what had happened before heading home. Over the next few days, we both looked online and in local news for any mention of strange lights or unusual sightings in and around Bozeman, but we didn't find anything. No reports or comments online, and no indication that anyone else had seen what we saw. It felt like it had only been meant for us to see. Aurora and I continued dating for about a year after that until she moved to Washington State for a really good job. We've stayed close friends and still talk occasionally through social media. We don't talk about that night often, but when we do, our memories of the event are still identical. Neither one of us has ever come up with an explanation. Even now, years later, it remains one of the most vivid experiences of my entire life.